This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent accredited graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. For more information, visit iwp.edu.
Our guest today is Chris Harmon, Professor Chris Harmon, a longtime friend and colleague of mine, and with a longtime experience at the Institute of World Politics. Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you.
Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and your background?
I'm teaching now for the Institute on military strategy, on Maoist revolutionary wars, on courses on terrorism and counterterrorism. I began in that respect right after 9/11, so I was here about some 20 years ago at IWP, and I knew John Lenchowski, the current chancellor, before that. My interest for the present subject comes in part from serving on the House staff. In the 80s, in the second term of Mr. Reagan, I got extremely involved in our office's contributions to this major idea. So from my small desk, I had a good perspective on it and was working on some of these issues like aid to Afghanistan and the Contras and so forth. I did the PhD before all that. I had a postdoctoral at Stanford University at the Hoover Institution. And I've also done quite a few books in my day. And so I'm just currently enjoying being a full-time professor here at the Institute of World Politics.
Yeah, and we go back to Marine Corps University. Don't want to forget that.
You should be.
Long time experience teaching at Quantico.
Yeah. I started teaching officers at the end of the 1980s at the Naval War College and then moved to Quantico where I met you. And it's also had some opportunities to go overseas. I ran a counterterrorism program at the Marshall Center for a while in terms of studies for foreign officers interested in the issue of counterterrorism.
And our topic today is the Reagan Doctrine, which we want to delve into. And you are connected to the Reagan Doctrine.
Well, I am personally very interested. I worked for Congressman Jim Corder in the Rayburn House Office building in the mid-'80s, and when this was a major foreign policy issue. It's a interesting sort of fact of the Institute that a number of us in the building have done this kind of work. Famously, John Lenchowski was on the National Security Council and worked for the Department of State, but also professors here who worked these issues include Al Santoli, Norman Bailey, Dennis Teddy. So there are quite a few of us beyond just you and me who are quite interested in Reagan's foreign policy and specifically this program. The program is a specific thing. I've found from students they're not too sure, so let me say it's a program designed to give aid, both lethal and non-lethal, to anti-communist insurgents that are fighting in the third world in countries specifically where a new communist government had been imposed from the outside and was getting aid from the communist bloc. So it isn't just an amorphous conception of freedom fighting or something. It was quite specific, and there were 4 or 5 countries that were routinely referred to with respect to the Reagan Doctrine.
Right. So going back into the history of this and the context, the need for this, let's talk a little bit about the 1970s. The post-Vietnam War period, you have, the high Brezhnev period of the Soviet Union and communism on the march in the developing world. So this was a response to a very urgent need given the circumstances.
I agree with that. The 1975 saw a transformation of Indochina, and people have been happily ridiculing the domino theory, but in fact, 3 countries go communist, and it's pretty ugly. And that's all before the Cambodian Revolution by the Khmer Rouge. So it's a hard time. The sense in Moscow, as I understand it, is that we're on the march, we're making gains at the expense of capitalism. And so they begin to spend a great deal of money in the third world. Our Central Intelligence Agency, including people interested in it like Bill Casey for the Reagan years, are acutely interested in a big upswing in Soviet expenditures in the third world, much of it for violent reasons and defense of governments that are communist. And so there are quotations available in the records in which they're boasting about the change of correlation of forces. Um, and that sense of progress of communism globally is really the circumstances into which Mr. Reagan's presidency comes. He's occasionally pilloried by inadequate observers for some kind of anti-communist paranoia, but the communists themselves are boasting of how well they're doing in the third world.
Oh, yes, and not just Southeast Asia, but I mean, you can go down the list of countries, right? I mean, in the 70s, not just Laos, Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia. We're talking about Mozambique. We're talking about Angola.
Yep.
We're talking about Ethiopia. We're talking about Yemen,
Yeah.
Nicaragua, right? Grenada.
Right
I mean,
in our-
the list goes on.
Right in our backyard. Yeah, the Africa picture is very disturbing. One of my more interesting books on the shelf is a 1985 report by the Library of Congress for the House. And the report shows the extent of Soviet effort and gains in the third world. And in the Africa case, which you mentioned, Ethiopia, there are Red Army troop transports moving Cuban soldiers from here to there across the continent of Africa as they work to uphold really awful governments that are pro-Moscow, like the one in Ethiopia, like the ones in Angola, Mozambique. Cuban soldiers, by the several tens of thousands, are actually fighting in Africa, which is an incredible thing geopolitically. I mean, that's a very rare moment in human history to see Caribbean soldiers fighting on the ground in Africa in massive numbers, and they're under Soviet command in many places, and they're using Soviet intelligence products, and they're being moved around or they're fighting with Soviet weapons.
Right. So the idea of communism on the march, I mean, it was obvious. I mean,
It was obvious at the time. I think many of our voters may have forgotten about that, but it was very obvious. Yeah.
yeah. And also in this country, people talking about the United States has to get used to being a second-class power, that, you know, this is the whole sort of post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, I would say the malaise that, you know, people talked about in the Carter era. But I mean, it was a very real perception amongst, pundits and other people in this country that the United States was kind of on the decline, which was also a talking point that came out of Moscow. That
Very much so. It does. You've reminded me of the current discussions in China. For some time, Xi Jinping's been fostering the notion that the U.S. is a country in decline, China's a country on the rise. So sometimes we get a little too wrapped up in what people are saying in Washington about what we think, but it's smart to go to look at the rival powers and see what they think. And in this period we're addressing, Moscow thinks it's doing exceedingly well, and they're putting up resources against that too. Billions and billions a year are being spent, and a great deal of military equipment from places like East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Soviet factories are landing in places like Africa, like Central America, in a way that's really a challenge to American security and to our friends like all the people of Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and so forth.
so, and not just on that level, but also the nuclear buildup, conventional buildup in Europe, the SS-20 deployments, all these things that the Soviets, just to contextualize it, the Soviets were definitely uh, seeing a future in which they would become the dominant global power, and the United States would enter the final stage of the crisis of capitalism, and of which they thought Reagan was a manifestation, like a hard right reaction that heralded the end of the American century.
And
So they
the direct affront, too, of the invasion of Afghanistan, when that happened in December of 79, there was considerable shock. People said things like, the Soviets have done a lot of things we don't like, but they've never crossed an international border and invaded like this. And they showed no interest in retracting. That only comes with the rise of the Mujahideen against them. Initially, there's every sense that they're going to continue to control that government, a sort of puppet communist government, and their forces were well in advance of 100,000. 100 is the number often used, but actually the actual number, I think, was higher. But they had no intention of leaving that country, which is a challenge to a lot of other countries, including China, Iran, so forth.
It's interesting how that was a turning point. And of course, Afghanistan plays a central role in the Reagan Doctrine and its execution, and is one of the great examples of victory, which I guess we'll get into. But the reason it was interesting as a turning point was because Afghanistan already had a communist government when the Soviet Union invaded. There had already been a revolution. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union invaded to remove an extreme and dysfunctional communist government and put in a more moderate communist government.
Yeah.
Hence, their response, their surprise at our reaction, because to Carter administration, it was like this big betrayal and the final straw, or however you want to characterize it. But from the Brezhnev point of view, they were wondering, what's wrong with the Americans? Don't they understand we're actually putting in a moderate communist government and getting rid of an extreme communist government? From their point of view, Afghanistan was already a done deal, and the invasion was just a police action. And so they were startled by our response when we had done nothing in 1968 when they invaded Czechoslovakia. We had done nothing in 1956 when they invaded Hungary, and we weren't likely to do anything, about martial law in Poland from their point of view. And incidentally, the same guy who planned the Afghan invasion was planning the Poland invasion in case they needed it, which it turns out they didn't. But yeah, the Soviets were completely surprised by our reaction. Yeah. Like, why are you so upset? We're just kind of cleaning this up.
The other part of their thinking, I think, is important is the famous Brezhnev Doctrine. So in the end of 1968, trying to digest the Czech crisis in which Soviets moved on the ground. They had forces there already. They reinforced them. They snuffed the Prague Spring. In reflecting on that, Mr. Brezhnev gives a major speech at the end of the year, and he basically says that the thing about communism is it's historic, and it's on a historical path, and history shows us that the reverses are not possible. The progress is required, the progress is inevitable, and anytime any outsiders try to change that trajectory of history, we have to respond in the strongest way possible. Thus, why we did what we did in Czechoslovakia, which some people might have imagined was a sovereign country, but it wasn't. It was functioning as a regular part of the Warsaw Pact. So the Brezhnev Doctrine from 1968 is also in the background of this Reagan Doctrine, because it says wherever communism is, of course they usually called it socialism, has appeared and is in power, then we have every right to defend it. So these shaky governments like your friends in Afghanistan or the others in Mozambique, Angola, have every right from the point of view of history to a rigorous defense from the communist bloc, and we can't fail our duty in that. And then there's another, the chairman of the international department of the party is a guy named Boris Ponomarev, and he lays down a kind of parallel thing in 1980 in which he says the world's on fire, the national liberation movements are doing really well, and wherever the communist movements are making progress, we have the duty to reinforce them. So from Moscow's perspective, not only is Soviet Union and their version of communism on the march, they simply won't accept any pushback, that traditional thing we all learn about in college classes in IR called rollback, in which people like Dwight Eisenhower consider, can we reduce the Soviets' footprint in Eurasia or something, in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, can we push them back? That notion of rollback was often discussed, never implemented, until our subject of today, the Reagan Doctrine.
So let's talk about the roots of that, what became the Reagan Doctrine and what people were thinking about in terms of trying to implement some kind of rollback strategy. And maybe you can comment on some of the folks who were talking about this.
Yeah, when the administration comes in the 1980s, there's quite a lot of ferment among policymakers about the right angle to take on the Soviet Union. There's some that think that negotiations are really important. There's smarter people who know that negotiations and use of force can be done together, and that's normally how international politics works, and especially when you're talking about a war like the ones that were being waged in Africa, in Central America. So as the response gets considered, the Reagan team with people like Richard Pipes and Al Haig and Bill Casey and a number of others start to consider whether some pushback on these newest Soviet encroachments is possible. And they consider the various options of diplomacy, non-lethal aid, lethal assistance. And it starts to look like there's some opportunities for engaging in some kind of rollback. So in 82 and then early 83, you see two different national security decision directives, they're called, in which the Reagan people say, this is how we're going to do this. We're going to try as best we can globally to contest the advance of the Soviet Union, and where we can improve on the situation, we'll push back against some of their most recent gains. So those go into formal documents, and they're vetted through the whole bureaucracy, and DOD and state and others get to consider this. And there's quite a contest. And as you know, as somebody working on a Reagan book, there's not full unity on the team.
Oh, well, absolutely. Some people were pushing back against it. Some people were pushing back against the whole strategy, trying to soft pedal it, like maybe Reagan's going too far and things like that, which is interesting with people who think that the president can just order something and it happens. Which, as we know, is definitely not true. Even if you don't have, so-called the resistance or things that President Trump has faced, even in normal circumstances, people have different ideas, and the whole interagency process, things get chewed up, and you just never know. But I want to go ahead.
Well, an amazing case of that is the tension that develops between, say, Secretary of State Schultz and some of the others on the team. Mr. Schultz. Yeah, Richard Pipes is a good example. Some on the team were in a more fighting mode, and Secretary Schultz was always trying to keep diplomacy primary. So when he thought about a particular nasty guerrilla war going on somewhere, which the Soviets were helping, he wanted frequently to have diplomacy effect a case in which all violent parties could stop and the Soviet bloc people could be retracted. And this shows up in Southern Africa, for example, when some, like Reagan, are interested in helping the Angolan resistance, which was called UNITA. He opposes it in an explicit letter to Bob Michael, who's the minority leader in the House of Representatives, because he wants not U.S. aid to UNITA, but some kind of regional peace plan. And so it's a good example of the way that people who are in the same White House, in the same meetings, can really contest with each other's views. Schultz and Casey were frequently at odds in this Reagan Doctrine business.
Yes, Mozambique, an interesting counterexample to the Reagan Doctrine in action, since we never actually supported the guerrilla movement there against the communist government, and the South African regime, which of course was no supporter of communism either back in the old apartheid times, signed a deal with Mozambique, the Nicomati Accord, in which basically, since South Africa was fighting their own guerrilla war against ANC guerrillas who were on their border, the deal was that we won't give a safe haven to your guerrillas if you don't give a safe haven to our guerrillas. And so that was realism in action, power politics, which was another wrinkle to why the United States didn't get involved in that, because it was being settled locally. Like, they just wanted to have, peace on that border, at least, while each side, the Mozambicans would fight their guerrillas, and then the South Africans would fight their war that was going on their border.
Yeah.
So, yes, more exciting 80s history.
Well, it was an interesting moral question for us in the Jim Corder office. He was, again, a representative from New Jersey. He was on the Armed Services Committee. And both Dennis Teddy from our faculty and John Lenchowski and I have all worked for Corder at a given time. He is a remarkable man. And one of the things we discussed in this basis was, we're supporting UNITA in Angola, but should we also be supporting the Renamo resistance in Mozambique? And the distinguisher for us in the Rayburn building was the kind of brutalities that Renamo was involved in. There were people agitating in the Washington realm, in the conservative areas, for adding Mozambique rebels to these other, the Contras, the Afghan Mujahideen, the Angola UNITAs, we did not do that, because prudentially we felt that Renamo was sort of part anarchy, part trouble, and not a kind of group like UNITA was, which actually had a functioning sub-state organization through about a third of Angola. They were governing, and they were legit, and they were thoughtful, and they had an education system. We judged that the Mozambique government was a horror show, but that the rebels were not the right tool for foreign policy, not the best thing for the future of Mozambique. So again, as we've been saying, prudence is a big part of this. And Mr. Reagan never did give military aid to Renamo. So he was not being promiscuous. He selected 4 or 5 places where material aid could be useful, but we did not arm those people. A good parallel is the whole notion of bin Laden, which you know a great deal about. I keep meeting Americans who think we helped bin Laden in Afghanistan. But al-Zawahiri himself, the number 2, in a book has twice said that he didn't get a penny from the Americans. And as far as I know, he did not. We aided Mujahideen factions. We did not aid al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. And so in the Reagan Doctrine years, there were a lot of debates about who deserved American aid, because the minute you start helping a movement, you're accepting a certain moral responsibility, and you're accepting the prudential problem of what if they fail? The United States was a lot of help to the Contras, but you know what? They lost. And Nicaragua became as wretched a place as could be, and it still is today, and it's run by the same guy, Daniel Ortega. So there's a lot of consequence to our aid to the Contras, and there's a lot of consequences to the fact that congressional and other resistance prevented us from making that successful. So we did get involved, and we ended up on the losing side. So these are very morally and politically challenging questions that Mr. Reagan had to work his way through as he designed this program of aid to anti-communist insurgents.
What was Bill Casey's role in all of this?
Well, Bill Casey is close to us in our institute because, of course, after his passing, his library came to us and is now part of our library system. He's not a man I knew personally, but he's a man who many in the building did know. He was, of course, a man from the Office of Strategic Services and then a highly successful New York financier. When he's chosen to be a head of CIA, there's certainly those in the bureaucracy that think he's, not the right kind of person for that job, but I think he was fabulous. I did know one of his aides. He chose a man as an aide for the Latin American world named Constantine Menges, who was very unpopular in the intelligence community, but who did a terrific book about our subject today called The Twilight Struggle. And Dr. Menges served with him and served at the NSC. And they began thinking about the proprieties and the methods for getting aid to the anti-communist resistance. And so Casey was really important in pushing for stiff material and often lethal aid. So debates that occurred over things like the Stinger missiles, which were very, very much of a game changer. Those turned heavily on Casey's views. Without his support, CIA could not have provided those anti-air weapons that were so destructive of the Soviet Union's air forces. And Stingers went to Angola and Afghanistan the same year, 1986.
Yes, the Stinger was absolutely critical because the Soviets, in their counterinsurgency, had essentially started to mimic what the United States had done in the Vietnam War in terms of the use of special operations forces, air mobility, critical, and coupled with ground action. But the air mobile aspect of it was the most important aspect of it for them. They were heavily dependent on helicopters. And once the Stinger came in, you saw helicopter activity basically go to zero. They just couldn't do it anymore because they had no effective defense against it. And also a nod to the British blowpipe, another weapon. And just to get into the bureaucratics of it, the Congress had mandated that the United States would not give this aid until another country did it first. And that's when Thatcher came to the rescue. And Margaret Thatcher started sending the blowpipe, and then that allowed Reagan to then send the Stinger. So, just a little nuance of that, how politics works.
There were quite a few countries, China, Saudi Arabia, Britain, that also wanted to see a change in Afghanistan. And Pakistan did a lot. Some people are critical of how the aid process was managed. Most of it went through Pakistan's ISI. But the aid was a complete game changer. And people sometimes speak of the Soviet withdrawal as something which Gorbachev decided upon because he wanted to focus on the economy. And that belies the fact that the Soviet Red Army was taking whipping in Afghanistan, and even with the new tactics that you've described.
Another person who was thinking and writing about these issues at the time, whom you've mentioned in the past, is Jack Wheeler. Maybe you could talk about what he was doing.
Yes, he's an exciting figure and had an oversized personality. He'd been profiled by a liquor company. He was a known adventurer. He was an innovative and fascinating person. He had a small think tank in California called the Freedom Research Foundation, and there's still an office in Washington where his son works, by the way. He is now living in Europe, and I've got to interview him. Well, Jack Wheeler was one of those innovators in the Reagan years who looked around the world at the various anti-communist insurgencies going on and said it would be tremendously in the world's interests, and specifically in the U.S. interests, if any of these revolutions were to be successful. And so talking with people like Jeane Kirkpatrick, the famous UN ambassador, with Reagan speechwriters, with William Casey and Constantine Menges and a bunch of others, Wheeler decided that we should make a powerful effort to aid these insurgents in at least about 5 countries. And he personally visited them. He traveled with guerrillas for weeks at a time, and then he wrote these reports up for Reason magazine, and the reports are extremely interesting. And from 83 to 85, he has this series of a half dozen articles about the different groups. He favored Renamo, but his other articles were on the Contras, on the Mujahideen, on the Angolan UNITA program. So he helped popularize many of the leaders in these third world fights. Jonas Savimbi eventually came to Washington, for example. People like Wheeler and Jeane Kirkpatrick were important in making that happen. They spoke at foundations. They went to the White House sometimes. And so the American people began to get a sense for some of the personalities. Wheeler was therefore highly creative, highly enterprising, and he had the magic of a particular idea, which is that instead of just seeing hot spots in the world, you could link them conceptually to people who were fighting for their own freedom against governments that had been imposed from the outside by Soviet bloc countries. And there was a kind of fire in the mind about all this for some people, including Wheeler. And thus you get a direct influence in some of the speeches made by presidential figures and others at the time. Mr. Reagan's speech in 81 in the inaugural was really important. It was followed by a Secretary Shultz speech. There were also major speeches in Costa Rica and in London about freedom. And so there's a kind of rhetorical and political background for this aid program that we've been discussing.
And this is long before the term Reagan Doctrine had been coined.
Yeah, the term actually is produced by that gentle genius named Charles Krauthammer, one of the greatest columnists ever.
Yeah.
A most wonderful person. Everyone liked him. He was a gentle soul, but such a brilliant man. And he watched the way this policy was developing and finally gave it the moniker of the Reagan Doctrine. I think Reagan only once in public made reference to it by himself, but it was after Krauthammer. So April 86 is when Krauthammer introduces the term. And basically the White House says, yeah, that's what we're doing. And it's working.
Yeah.
A recent book about Reagan complains that there's no sign of progress in some of these fights. But that's naive because this is an attritional strategy. This isn't a kind of invade the neighbor, crush his army, and read your Clausewitz. This is an attritional strategy in which Soviet forces in the Third World are drained down and made to commit increasing numbers and weapons, which are expensive. And then in moral terms, in which the weaknesses of the guerrillas begin to change and evolve and develop into simple kinds of strengths. Where they can test those governments. It's a strategy of attrition, therefore it's a slow-moving strategy, and therefore it makes no sense to complain that we can't see victory in Nicaragua in 1983. You need some time, but we did see it in the place you worked on a lot, Afghanistan, and that was conceived by people like Wheeler and Kirkpatrick as a kind of like a classy vase. It looks very beautiful, but it's very fragile. And if you can crack it, the whole thing may shatter. And Jack Wheeler's view was if in any one of these fights we can get a clear victory, the prestige of the Soviet Union will be broken, the Brezhnev Doctrine will look silly, and the forces of freedom everywhere will be very excited, which is what happened.
You know, in a way, it's a counterpart to the Wars of National Liberation strategy. I've always looked at it that way, that we did what they did. When we were the status quo power in many of these countries, they fought us with guerrillas that they had supported, covertly, sometimes overtly. Now they were the status quo power in these countries, fine. Here's your own medicine.
It is. And when you get something like as extensive as, say, the shadow government that UNITA ran in a huge part of Angola, and you can see the administration, the horticulture projects, the schooling for children and secondary, Jonas Savimbi had a PhD in poli-sci from Switzerland, and he also had trips to China. So he understood the notions of guerrilla warfare, and he understood the politics of freedom, both, and he managed to bring those together. And for long, long years, it looked like he would be a great alternative to the communists of the MPLA government. Again, of course, he will eventually lose this fight, and then the world has to live with communism in Angola. A few years ago, the Dos Santos regime's descendant, a woman, turned out to be one of the most rich people in the whole world, certainly in Africa, based on corruption of that regime in Angola. They have some of the world's best oil resources, and the party was snarfing this all up at the expense of the Angolan people. And this is the kind of fight that we were in at the time, and that Jonas Savimbi and UNITA actually offered a real alternative to that kind of government. And sadly, it didn't work out, although the party still functions. And since at least 92, the MPLA government has no longer been the sole legal party, which is the old Stalinist model.
Yeah, it's a shame what happened to Savimbi. Well, speaking of victory, and something that's not always included in discussions of the Reagan Doctrine per se, but was definitely an important victory for the United States. Let's talk about Grenada a little bit. Of course, another place where the communists, with the New Jewel movement, had achieved a victory, taken over a small developing world country. But it was the one case where the United States intervened directly and militarily and fought back and won. So how does that tie into the Reagan Doctrine conceptually and strategically?
I think the importance strategically is very clear. In moral terms, for the Reagan administration, it was an important feather for the cap, because we'd been driven out of Lebanon by terrorism in Beirut. Which was a sad thing for the Lebanese people and for us both. And some of the same forces being evacuated from there were then used in Grenada. Of course, the spark was the disintegration of governance and a coup inside Grenada and a threat to some of our medical students there. That was the spark. The larger picture is that government had been increasingly integrated into the Soviet bloc, and there were hundreds of Cubans there. There were members of the other bloc states there too. They had a series of treaties and agreements which included things like propaganda and provision of media training, student scholarships for work inside the Soviet bloc, and a lot of military requirements were being met too. There were weapons that were to come in from North Korea. The technical and agricultural and military sectors were all being worked by various East European countries. So there's the process of integration of that little island into the Soviet world was ongoing. One of the leaders of the coup was actually a fan of Stalinist literature, for example, and this was being used in party education. There were high numbers of political prisoners in jail in Grenada. So it was pretty wretched. And this opportunity in the fall of '83, I think, again, is a great example of Reagan as a statesman, because a lot of people would not have done this. The notion, when you have the kind of record the U.S. has in Latin world, the notion of intervening with a lot of force would have been quickly banished in many a meeting in the National Security Council. When Reagan goes ahead with this, it's a very tough judgment, and it's a highly successful one. And one of the many changes, apart from democracy in Grenada, for guys like us in the poli-sci business is the recovery of a mass of documents from party archives in which we have original typescripts, signed documents, reports from people who went through the East Bloc soliciting arms and got them, and the rhetorical patter which goes along with the new communist government, the indulgence of all things extremely left-wing, candid discussions about how we got to lobby better in Moscow so we're seen as more respected within the so-called socialist community. These documents have all been published by the State Department, and they're an incredible record. So in a most recent biography of Reagan by Max Boot, for example, he deprecates the whole intervention, and he says that Margaret Thatcher thought it was stupid. And you get a very strange perspective of the whole thing, which I think from reading the Grenada papers, which, by the way, do not seem to have fueled research in Mr. Boot's book. He has a lot of resources listed, but I'm not sure he studied the Grenada papers. When you look at those, you can see that it's already being regarded as, the next Hungary, the next Czechoslovakia, the next Cuba, the next Nicaragua. There's, again, that sense of momentum. And you'd seen revolution in Cuba, Nicaragua, now Grenada, and what can we secure next? Reagan rolled all that back. It's the first case in so long where a communist country was literally rolled right back into a democratic state.
Right. And at the time, of course, there was this narrative in the pundit class, I guess, which is reflected in Boot's book, that this was, the superpower beating up on this little island. It didn't make any sense. The students were not really in danger because the communist government told us so. And, this type of thing, that it was really downplayed. But at the time when I was at the Fletcher School and we were interviewing some people who had come from the Soviet bloc, and this was a few years later, one of the Soviet ideologists mentioned that this, for what the reason you just mentioned about the rollback, this is the first time ever that a communist regime that had been established was pushed back. It was a complete violation of the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Yes.
And that in the ideological circles of the Soviet Union, in any case, it had a tremendous impact because they could not explain it. Marxism is a ratchet effect. The Marxist-Leninist model goes in only one direction, only expanding. And now all of a sudden, and from a country that was supposed to be collapsing, and particularly in 1983, when relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union were extremely dicey, and now the United States does this and extinguishes a communist dictatorship that wasn't supposed to happen. They couldn't explain it. And they never did explain it because, they usually come up with a hokey explanation for everything to try to make, the Marxist-Leninist model congruent to the facts of history that are, for some reason, doing things that Lenin didn't predict. And this one they just couldn't handle.
So if you put together the Grenada victory and then the Mujahideen's victory in Afghanistan, you've got what looks from their perspective like a real assault on the integrity of the Soviet Empire and the so-called socialist enterprise. And, Dr. Menges, in his book, The Twilight Struggle, which was published about 1990, says, he's writing at the time of the disintegration of communism in Europe. And he's saying, it's not implausible that what we've done in places like Angola, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, maybe he was thinking of Grenada, are having some of the effect in Eastern Europe. When you see the mood change and you see the courageous people begin to openly deprecate communism, and you see Gorbachev's unwillingness to reinforce it as Brezhnev would have, it's quite possible some of this Reagan Doctrine limited victories in the Third World had that effect inside the Eastern European world. I wouldn't put it past it.
Oh, yeah. The whole thing was an incredible blow to the legitimacy of the Soviet Union that they had carefully constructed over decades as this progressive, forward-looking, inevitable power, and all of a sudden it's not inevitable. And I mean, we know that their economy was a wreck. We know that their human rights record was atrocious. I mean, no one was flocking to get into the communist bloc. All they had going for them was this idea that they were inevitable. And once you pierce that idea, then they're not. And we saw the results, which, of course, nobody at the time, other than the Reagan team, predicted. Again, it was kind of like Reagan's revenge. Look at the results. He implemented this strategy, this comprehensive strategy, not just the Reagan Doctrine, but all of it. At the nuclear level with SDI and intermediate nuclear force agreement and the conventional buildup in Europe and all of it, and it worked. I mean, it's absolutely clear that it worked. I don't know if Max Boot would agree, but clearly Reagan, he came in with an idea, he consistently implemented that idea throughout his administration, and he got results. So given that, is there an application for that kind of thinking or Reagan Doctrine style thinking today when we look at the various challenges that we face? I know it's not exactly the same because China is pursuing their expansion in a little bit different way than the Soviet Union did. But nevertheless, there are, say, looking at the Kurds in Syria, or maybe there are resistance groups in Iran, or other places where the United States can play a constructive role that doesn't involve a, Iraq-style invasion.
There may be, it is very much circumstance dependent, I think, given the disintegration of the empire. Cases would be studied very much on the basis of a regional circumstance. There's a lot, I think, in the behind the Reagan Doctrine is a conviction of a superpower, and a superpower that was anti-American and that was growing at our expense, and which was therefore highly dangerous to us existentially. As you say, most countries aren't in that situation, and the China case is a good example because the Chinese have been very clever, very subtle, and they've worked kind of more intellectually, economically, and they worked in physical ways on what they call a forward edge, moving very slowly in places like the South China Sea, and often in ways that are confrontational but not very lethal. They used to give, of course, material aid to a lot of groups, and in fact now it's pretty hard to find ones that they're overtly or covertly aiding revolutionary groups. And so with the subtleties of that, we're not presented with the same circumstances. So statesmen would have to do a lot of thinking about material lethal aid to any guerrilla group, because there are certainly a lot of consequences to it. Certainly what's most memorable for me about the whole experience is the triumph of an idea, the kind of Thomas Paine common sense, high ideals related to democracy are really vindicated by the Reagan Doctrine. There's an incredible congruence of ideas and national security problems, and his solution is a very high-minded one and was wildly successful. Sun Tzu tells us that the greatest strategy is when you can win without fighting. And in many respects, if the Korean and Vietnam cases are in the rearview mirror and you're in the 1980s, in many respects, the 1980s saw a magnificent and global victory without overt warfare.
Well, I don't think I could say it better than that. Chris, thanks for joining us on the IWP podcast. It's great to have you here. I'm sure we're going to be continuing this discussion, on the second floor at IWP. And thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply Now.